You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Greetings and welcome. Our opening prayer is from the Acts of the Apostles. Then Paul stood up and said, "You Athenians, I see that in every respect you are very religious." This talk is going to look at Paul's speech in Athens. And the opening prayer was the opening of his speech there. I've titled this The Magnificent Failure, and I hope you'll see why as we go through it. It's a fascinating speech for a number of different reasons. It's in the 17th chapter of Acts of the Apostles. The speech itself starts in verse 22 and runs to verse 34. We find in chapter 17, back in verse 15, that Paul arrives in Athens, while the speech itself begins in verse 22. He's giving this speech in the intellectual and cultural capital of the world, more so than Rome at this time, which was certainly the military and political capital of the world. But Athens still had its claim to being a center for thought and discussion. And this speech is a masterpiece. Many scholars hold, that it is the greatest that he gave to the pagans. Of any of the speeches that we have in Acts of the Apostles or things of that sort, that this was the best to the pagans. Of the ones that Luke, who is the author of Acts of the Apostles, the same Luke who is the author of the Gospel, he puts in many speeches of Paul, both to Jews and to Gentiles, as well as speeches of others such as Peter. But again, this one is considered the best to the pagans by Paul, and yet it is a flop. So let's take a look at it and see what happened. The context for it starts with verse 16. Paul is in Athens, and while he's waiting for two of his closest companions to come and join him, that would be Silas and Timothy, he's exasperated, Luke tells us, by all the idols that he sees everywhere, all over in Athens. Now, the Greeks and the Romans, too, had myriads of gods and goddesses for all kinds of things, for all different kinds of events in their history and such. You may remember them from your own education. And Paul, as was his custom, starts to speak first in synagogues and then goes to the pagans. That was his usual method wherever he went. He would first go to the synagogues and usually be thrown out of them, and then he would go to the Gentiles. And so he's true to form here with this. He debated in the synagogues in verse 17, Luke tells us, with the Jews and with the worshippers, and daily in the public square with whoever happened to be there for it. So he does both. These open-air discussions were part of the tradition in Athens. In verse 18, Luke mentions two philosophical schools, the Epicureans and the Stoics, that would sort of hold court there for that. And also that Paul would discuss with them as well different things. So these philosophical schools, along with others, would hold forth in marketplaces, in public places. And Paul would go to synagogues and into these public places. So that's the context that sets this up. He's been doing this for some time. We don't know how long. We don't know how long he was waiting for his companions to come. But the result is that the Athenians don't take him seriously. As a matter of fact, as the translations put it, some asked, "What is this scavenger trying to say?" The idea, the Greek underneath there, is a word that means a seed picker or a bird picker. It's a term of derision. It's the idea, the image that it gives is like birds picking up scraps in a marketplace. Yes, it's like pigeons on the streets of a big city. That's the idea. If that came to mind for you, that would be very accurate. It's a term of this group of the Athenians, and it is a term of derision. And it is applied to Paul. They think of him as sort of like a scavenger. The translation there is good for it. But the idea of someone who just picks up scraps of teachings, the teachings of others, and expounds on them for his own profit. And those of the philosophical schools that would be there, and others as well, would look upon Paul in this way. He was sort of an amateur in their eyes, a dilettante, perhaps we could say. And because he speaks of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, these are strange notions. And they think, therefore, that he is proposing foreign deities, or what would seem to them to be foreign deities. Now, interesting for this. Let's take a look at this in the translation, of course, but it's accurate. So what is this scavenger, this bird or seed picker, this pigeon, if you will, not to get too light about it? What is he trying to say? Others said he sounds like a promoter of foreign deities because he is preaching about Jesus and resurrection. Now, you remember from your history classes or your Western Civ classes, perhaps, that the same was said of Socrates. In fact, these were the charges that were brought against Socrates, that he was promoting new deities. Perhaps this is not mere coincidence that Luke speaks of it in this way. It's something to keep in mind and to think about. The strange deities, Jesus, and also the concept of resurrection. So this is the context before the speech that we're going to look at in particular. They've listened to him a little bit. They had a tradition of being open to different thought, and he gets his chance there, but it is rejected. But then they decide that they will take him to the Areopagus. This is pronounced in different ways, and I'll probably pronounce it a number of different ways and mangle it a little bit, but basically it's the Areopagus or Areopagus, but two of the more familiar ways, the more common ways that it is pronounced, but you understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so they invite him to speak there. He gets his chance in verse 19 to go to this place. Now, it's a place and it's also a group of people. The Areopagus is a place on a hill in Athens, in the city itself, and also to a group met there who were sort of like a council of elders. And so, because they met on this hill, they became known as the Areopagus as well. So it's either the group of people or it's the place. So they're going to give him a hearing. They are open to new ideas. That was part of their tradition. And they're going to give him a big audience then. He's been doing it in small groups just in the marketplace, here and there, as people will listen to him after he's out of the synagogues. But now he's going to have a chance to give a public speech to a rather larger audience. We don't know how big at all. There's some speculation, but it's just that, speculation. And it's interesting that in verse 21, Luke sort of takes a little jab at the Athenians, a little sarcasm there. He says, as we read in verse 21, "Now, all Athenians, as well as foreigners residing there, use their time for nothing else but telling or hearing something new." So they were just after novelty, not really real truth or any depth or something like that. It seems Luke is sort of dismissing them a little bit for this, but at any rate, this is Paul's big chance. And so he begins. He stood up in the Areopagus, please pardon me as I muddle through that, and said, "You Athenians, I see that in every respect you are very religious." He starts out with flattery, of all things. And this too might have had a little of a twinge of sarcasm, like Luke had in the previous verse. But it does serve to ingratiate Paul with the Athenians. He goes on in verse 23, "For as I walked around looking carefully at your shrines, I even discovered an altar inscribed to an unknown God." So he's flattered them. He praises their religiosity. Of course, he doesn't agree at all with their paganism or its pantheon of gods and goddesses. But yet, he starts out that way because, truth be told, many thinking Athenians would be of the same mind. An intellectual person by this time would not be taking a lot of the mythology seriously, and would certainly look askance at the emperor worship recently coming out of Rome. And so the idea of trying to cover all the bases, to make sure that they didn't leave anybody out, you can't be too careful, you might be offending a god, but not really taking all of this so seriously, but again, being careful in case there really were some gods out there that could make a difference in your life. You don't want to offend them, and you don't want to leave anyone out. So he had the unknown God, unless they inadvertently forget anyone for this. And this is Paul's handle, if you will. This is his in to start out his speech. He zeroes in on this unknown God. And he says he's going to speak of this God. And actually, not so much a foreign deity as got Socrates in trouble, but yet not just another in the vast array of popular divine beings, because that would turn off the Athenians immediately. So it's really a stroke of genius. Starts out with the flattery, plays to something they could agree with, and sort of works his way in slowly. Again, the sophisticated thinking Athenians are not buying into this whole pantheon of gods and goddesses anymore, but they do believe in some kind of a deity, some kind of deity for it. And Paul uses this. Again, it's a stroke of genius on his part. And so he begins in verse 24 to appeal to the intellectual side of the Athenians. And he says things that they would easily agree with. He starts by saying, "What therefore you unknowingly worship, I proclaim to you." And in verse 24, he starts with a philosophical discussion. "The God who made the world and all that is in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in sanctuaries made by human hands." And the Athenians would easily agree with that. "Nor is he served by human hands because he needs anything." And they would agree with this as well. Again, for many of the common people, the gods and goddesses were still very much part of their lives and everything, but for the intellectual Athenians, they're not buying this kind of stuff. They abandoned this sometime before, perhaps, for it. And Paul knows that, and he starts out with that. "No, the real God dwells in heaven beyond all these human attributes. This is the true God who made heaven and earth and all within." Now in this, Paul is not too far away from Judaism either. In the Bible, both Old and New Testament, there are two viewpoints, two theologies, if you will. They are not in any way in opposition or contradicting each other or in competition with each other. They are rather complementary. The one seen most familiarly in the Old Testament is what's called salvation history theology. That God is active in the world. He enters into our history. He calls his people. Consider Abraham, for instance. He frees them from slavery in Egypt, all of the things of Moses. He brings them to the promised land. Joshua goes in and conquers it. He's very much a part of human affairs, this God. The other viewpoint, the other perspective, again, not in competition or contradiction or opposition, is what's called creation theology. The stress here is on God as creator and sustainer of the universe. No beginning or end, all pervasive, the one who sets the times and seasons and laws for all of nature. But of course, this is one and the same God. He is both involved in creation, which he himself brought about. So there isn't opposition. It's the same God. Now, for the Athenians, they have no knowledge of what is in the Old Testament. And so they have no knowledge of the salvation history theology. They have no idea of God calling his people, the chosen people, bringing them out of slavery, bringing them to the promised land. That would be unknown to all of them. So Paul appeals to the more philosophical realities, the creation theology. That they can understand, that they can accept. God, who made everything in the world, its rules and its instructions, is the giver of life and breath to all living things. And so in verses 24 to 26, this is the theme that Paul takes up for this. So picking it up there in 25, he's not served by human hands because he needs anything. Rather, it is he who gives to everyone life and breath and everything. That's creation theology, right out of, for instance, the wisdom literature. The wisdom literature in the Old Testament will stress this perspective of creation theology. Doesn't deny salvation history theology, actually joins the two together, but will stress this philosophical side of God as creator, as the one who sustains everything in being, and is himself not created. So he made from one the whole human race to dwell in the entire on the entire surface of the earth, and he fixed the ordered seasons and the boundaries of their regions. So all of nature, natural law, all the things of science that we know and such come from God as the creator for this. And of course they would not understand it as we understand it, but they would appreciate the thought behind it, of this idea of God as creator. They wouldn't understand this science as we know it today, obviously, but the principle is still there. So that people might seek God. And so the Athenians would very, very much agree with this, but they wouldn't agree with any kind of gods and goddesses fighting each other and having control of different things and getting mad at people and you have to appease the gods. They're not going to buy into all of this. But the idea of this supreme being, as they could, at least as far as they could understand it, that they would agree with. Okay. Now, so Paul notes then that people whom God has created strive to know him, although in sometimes less than clear or successful ways. So even though God is not far from us, people grope for him, and that's a good characterization. It's a good translation, and it's a good way to characterize it. They grope for God. At least the pagans do. Of course, God revealed himself to the chosen people. It's different there. But for these pagan Athenians, they are groping for him, for this. So all of this would make sense to a thinking, sophisticated Athenian. And Paul even goes on, in a great stroke of genius, to quote their own philosophers. He calls them poets, but he quotes a couple of them. So as we go on here, we'll go up now to verse 27, so that people might seek God, even perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from any one of us. For, and here he starts to quote, in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets, philosophers and philosopher poets, they were combined oftentimes in the ancient cultures. Your poets have said, for we too are his offspring. And that's another quote there as well. So he's working from something very familiar to the Athenians for this. They'd have no problem with any of this. He gives these quotes, and they would agree with them. And so Paul also notes that if this be true, that in him we live and move and have our being, we are God's offspring in the sense that they would understand it, then this God does not reside in some statue, nor is this God a product of our own imagination. And Paul is very clear with that. We ought not to think that the divinity is like an image fashioned from gold, silver, or stone, or human art and imagination. Exactly so. No problem with that at all. The Athenians would have no problem agreeing with that. Now, though, in verse 30, Paul will move his argument away from just the philosophical, intellectual to the moral. And so we read in verse 30, God has overlooked the times of ignorance, but now he demands that all people everywhere repent, because he has established a day on which he will judge the world with justice through a man he has appointed, and he has provided confirmation for all by raising him from the dead. Now he has moved into the idea of judgment and in the moral sphere, and the idea of the responsibility that we have. He speaks of God overlooking past ignorance of people, such as those who worshipped idols, and says there is a coming judgment day, and the judge will be one whom God has appointed. This is new ground for the Athenians. Paul then states that God has proven that this will happen by raising this one who will be the judge from the dead. Paul has had them in the palm of his hand up to this point, but now he loses them. He was doing great. In verse 32, Luke tells us, when they heard about resurrection of the dead, some began to scoff. So he had him. He was doing great. But then he loses them for this idea of someone rising from the dead. The idea of a judgment or being responsible for your actions, that would be okay to a certain extent for them, moving into the moral sphere of how you live your life. But this idea of resurrection, and that someone was going to judge who has been raised from the dead, this is different. So some of Paul's hearers openly scoff at him when he speaks of resurrection from the dead. Others use a line that sometimes has been used through the centuries in other contexts: we should like to hear you on this some other time. This response can be ambiguous as we see it here in Acts. Some may have meant that they would hear Paul later on, that they had some kind of an interest. It may be some later time okay, we'll get back to this, and we will listen and have you explain it a little bit more. But given the skepticism that greeted Paul before he was here at this main speech, that Luke tells us when he first got to Athens, already the Athenians have expressed this skepticism. It's rather not ambiguous in the sense that some would really have an interest, but others would just simply be brushing Paul off. And so we should like to hear you on this some other time. Well, maybe with some goodwill. We'll listen to you sometime. But most likely, and for the most of his hearers, we should like to hear you on this some other time. Just forget it. Get lost. Just brushes him off in a contemptuous, kind of dismissive way. And that's oftentimes how the phrase is used in this day and age for it. And so it doesn't work in a sense. It's not a huge success. And Luke goes on to tell us that. So what is Paul's reaction then? He leaves them. He walks away. He simply leaves them for that. He doesn't counter them with other arguments. He doesn't yell at them or condemn them for their ignorance or their closed-mindedness to his message. In the other extreme, he doesn't try to mollify them by changing his message or the intent behind it. He doesn't come back and say, well, wait a minute. Let me modify this a little bit. Does this sound better to you? Can you accept this? No, he doesn't do that. And he doesn't yell at them. The same way our Lord, when his teachings were not accepted, did not yell and condemn his hearers, nor did he change, modify, or water down his teaching, especially, for instance, in John's Gospel, when Jesus is teaching about the Eucharist. And John tells us, this is a hard saying, people thought, some of them, and walked away. And Jesus said to his disciples, do you too want to leave? And of course Peter says, where shall we go? To whom shall we go? So Jesus did not change. He didn't condemn either. Paul does neither of those as well. He simply walks away. A few do follow him. It's not a total failure for that. And so Luke tells us about that in verse 34. But some did join him and became believers. Two of them are mentioned. One of them, Dionysius, who is a member of this court of the Areopagus, this council. So again, it's a place and it's also a group of people, this council of elders or statesmen or something for it. We're not sure exactly what all it was. At least we don't get any indication from the Bible. We can get some other indication from non-biblical literature. But at any rate, one of the members does join him, and also a woman named Damaris. We don't know anything about her from the Bible. And some others that are not named as well. That's it. Just these two that are mentioned by name, and some others, very few in number, for it. And that's it. And it's over. Now, a little bit of analysis here of what is going on. Again, Athens is a great opportunity for St. Paul, and he knows that. They have a reputation for debate and discussion, and of course, Paul is never going to shy away from those things. And so he's going to take it to them. And he starts, before he even gets to this great speech at the Areopagus, he starts out by sparring with anyone and everyone who will listen to him. And of course, that was his way. He's in his element here, we could say, for this. And he finds resistance. But that does not discourage him at all. Jesus and the resurrection of the dead, resurrection of Jesus and of all, looking forward to the future resurrection of all, is not received favorably. And again, they have no knowledge of Jesus. There are pagan mystery religions at this time and certain cults of the time that had a mythology of a dying and rising God. Now, some of the Athenians may have thought Paul was just another one of these. This might have been the picking up of little scraps of things that they thought Paul was doing for it. So, in the first part of the time that Paul is there in Athens, when he goes to the synagogues and then goes to the marketplace, he's learning, in a sense. He's learning what'll work and what doesn't. He's refining his technique. The message is the same. He's not changing that. But he's learning about his audiences and what works and what doesn't. Then he gets his big chance, the Areopagus, and a sizable audience. He's very careful. He starts out with the flattery. He starts to win them over. He's a genius at this. They are kindly disposed towards him. He knows his audience well, and he knows what's going to work. He uses what is familiar and acceptable to them. He agrees with some of their ideas. He uses what is good from Greek thought. And Paul has a foot in both cultures. He is very much in the Jewish culture, being the good rabbi that he is, and also he has the education of the secular culture, the Greek, from no mean city of Tarsus. So he had both, and he could use both, and his epistles show both influences there as well. So he'll take what is good from Greek thought, as did the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, written towards the end of the period of the Old Testament, when Greek influence and Egyptian influence as well in wisdom was starting to be felt. And there were good things about these philosophical groups and could be used for that, even though, of course, Paul is not going to believe in the pantheon of the gods and everything else. That's a part of that. But he will take what is good. So he starts to bring them in, and he tries to move them beyond simply the philosophy of creation. So he adds the moral aspect to make it relevant to their daily lives, something that involves them, something that has consequences for them. So the philosophical understanding of creation got them to exist, but where do you go from there? And so the idea of a moral responsibility and accountability for your life, your existence, being answerable to someone for it, he moves them in that direction. He's moving them into a bit of newer territory. Now, they had an idea of a moral life and such, but they conceived of it on different principles, more like what we would consider natural law for this. But yet still, as Paul starts to move them beyond that, it's nothing that would really startle them at this point. As a matter of fact, they probably at this point were intrigued as to where Paul was going with this, especially as he moved in to the moral aspect. Where was this leading to? Now, in all of this, think for a moment. You read through all of this, it's amazing. Nowhere in this entire speech does Paul mention Jesus. We know who he's got in mind. No doubt about it. But when he gives the speech to this group of pagans, he never mentions Jesus by name. We know who he means and who he has in mind. But when he speaks of the resurrection, that's when he fails. They won't accept the resurrection of someone as a proof of the coming judgment. They might have thought it was just another one of those mystery religions, another one of those cults who had a dying and rising God. Paul tried to avoid getting directly into that, but they just dismiss him then at that point. They openly reject him, Some of them by scoffing, as the translation says. Luke tells us they scoffed at him. Others just barely, politely put him off for that. And Luke gives the results. And they're very puny. 2 people in particular, and a few more unspecified. Also, too, Paul's reaction. To take a look at that. He just moves on. It could be, perhaps, very much like the admonition that Jesus gave to his disciples when he sent them out on mission. And he said, if you're not successful, just simply shake the dust from your feet and move on. That was a sort of quasi-official gesture that was used in the Jewish world. There were a couple of these kinds of things. We find them in the Bible. The tearing of garments when you heard blasphemy was another one. These kinds of actions, gestures to show a reaction. And so Jesus says, shake the dust from your feet and just move on. Well, Paul could have done that too. He could have just shook the dust from his feet and go out for that. We don't know that he did, but he could have. It was a tremendous effort. It didn't totally fail, but it was nowhere near a resounding success. The speech, if you take a look at it, is magnificent. It's a magnificent effort. It's finely crafted. It's carefully reasoned, well thought out, well tailored to the hearers, his audience, and presented with enthusiasm. It is logical in its progression. It's subtle, and, if you will, in a way, it's sly, with his opening flattery and playing to what he knows will work and such. But in the end, it's all to very little avail. Now, why would Luke even put this in then, you might ask? Well, Luke, in writing the Acts of the Apostles, is giving us the early history of the church. And he gives us both the triumphs and the tragedies, much greater ones than just this simple speech. But he puts it all out there. Consider, for instance, at the beginning of Acts, the event of Pentecost and the first successful preaching of the apostles, like Peter's speech in Pentecost, right after Pentecost, the great successes, and then in contrast, the failures, the martyrdom of Stephen, for instance, and the other difficulties that Paul has as well. Luke puts everything out there, the good and the bad, if you will, the triumphs and the tragedies, the successes and the failures, because that was the reality. And in spite of all those difficulties, the church is triumphant. And that's part of the message as well. Jesus himself was rejected. The evangelists show us that on several occasions, where they won't listen to him. And of course, the final rejection was on Calvary, but it was a triumph over all for this. And so Luke does have things like this speech. He could have left it out because it wasn't all that successful, but it's wonderful. And it was one that shows what the reaction was. This is the way it was. This is real life for this. And for us, it could be a matter for our meditation. We can stop for a moment then and consider the successes and the failures in our own lives. More specifically, think in your own experience of some time when you put a lot of effort into something very important, say. Perhaps trying to help someone who really needed your aid. Someone who was in some difficulty, and you wanted to help them. You were able to do it. You had the resources to be able to do it, whatever the context might have been. Not just something materially, but it might have been emotional support or counseling or in some way doing something for someone that would have helped them, getting them in contact with help, whatever it might have been. Think in your own experience for a moment. You were able to do it. You wanted to do it. You knew it was for the good of someone or maybe a group of people, and yet your help was turned down. And in the end, the result was a mess for the person or the people that you wanted to help. That's life. It's not to cause one to quit, but perhaps to redouble one's efforts and to go on and to do even more. Always having confidence in our God and in our goal. Paul did a magnificent job. He did it well. Well planned, well thought out, well executed. And maybe he did leave disappointed, but there's no doubt he left with his head held high.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.